Can you explain how your thesis idea evolved during like the first year or the thesis year, like from the beginning till the end? What was the evolution, the idea?
Um, Initially, I really had no clue about what direction I wanted to follow. I knew I wanted to do something that had to do with installation work. I knew that I wanted to do something with programming, with interactivity, but I really didn't know where or how I could do this. Um, so in the middle of thesis, I had a project which I pitched to a Brazilian musician called Carlinhos Brown, and Carlinhos Brown is a very famous um, musician which plays in Carnival in Salvador and plays a lot of percussion instruments and is really an entertainer. And we pitched Carlinhos. I say we because I worked on this with an artist called Kyle McDonald, and we pitched Carlinhos the idea of doing an electronic percussion suit where he would wear a suit filled with basically pressure sensors, and as he hit his body, those sensors would act as percussion instruments. And it was really successful in terms of what we wanted to do and the outcome. And when I came back, this was in the middle of March. I had to hand in my thesis in mid-May, and when I came back, it still wasn't clear what I wanted to do. I mean, I was interested in doing something with sound, and what ended up happening is I ended up trying to pursue this idea that had something to do with music, with interactivity, and instead of really taking forward a finished project, which we did with Carlinhos Brown, and try to hand that as my thesis, I took the idea of samba and how samba could be reinterpreted. And what I did was that, I did a lot of research and ended up running into the works of Janet Cardiff. And Janet Cardiff is this great artist that does sound installation. And her main piece is basically a piece where she has, 50 or 60 speakers in a room in a circle, and she reinterprets on the choir of or an orchestra. It depends which installation it is. And basically, as you get close to these speakers, you hear the sound of a single member of the orchestra, which is really interesting. And that really inspired me to basically take samba and really think about how samba can be heard individually. So samba, especially in Rio de Janeiro and the Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, is played through many, many percussion instruments. Most of the time, 8 percussion instruments, though. So how could I take the idea of Janet Cardiff and make that interactive within the realm of what I was working? So what I did was I took and found a library of these instruments and found a way to basically create these loops of all instruments playing together. So these mini songs almost. And basically taking each instrument and putting it in the installation. And what the installation was about, it was basically an installation where you would walk into a room, and the installation had 8 speakers. And when you were in the center of the room, all speakers would play. So each speaker stood for a percussion instrument. However, as you walked around and got closer to a single speaker, all other sounds or speakers or instruments would fade out, and that one single speaker would play. So as you moved around the room, you really became the instructor or the master of percussion, and you decided how samba should be heard. And I guess I went that direction because the sounds of samba are so interesting, and they're just very, very rich. However, as you listen to each individual instrument of samba, you realize how really complex it is.
Yeah.
So that was the aim of the whole installation, I guess,
Oh,
and
nice.
that's how it progressed.
Okay. And talking about like the participants of the installation, what kind of experience were you envisioning for them at the beginning, or maybe like throughout all the process? Like, what were you expecting them to feel, or what kind of experience were you expecting for them?
Well, the thing about putting up this installation in a place like, New York or in the United States is that the reactions are a lot different than if I were to put this installation in Rio. And what ends up happening here is that, although this is a multicultural city, especially New York, and it's so rich and people, have very deep knowledge of culture in general, the people we usually hang out with or know or meet. It's different from other places in the United States for sure. But what I mean is that although that's what usually people are, you still have this sense of, exotic, uncommon when you talk about, Brazil or samba. People still have these stereotypes that they refer to, and the whole objective of it was, I put this in a white room and there was no graphics, there were no visuals. And because all I really wanted to do was to be able to listen to the percussion instruments and really try to get a grasp and understand how these percussion instruments are developed or played. And it was interesting. I thought some people would just listen to it and test the interactivity and see how it works. But one thing I found was that when people walked into the installation, they looked for the sound. So the speakers were hanging from the ceiling, and what ended up happening is that everyone would be looking up, looking to where the sound was coming from, and that gave me the idea that maybe there would be a more interesting scenario to put this instrument in. Maybe where people couldn't see the speakers or couldn't see where the sound was coming from. But people really need visual feedback. I see that, and I see that it's something people really, really look for when they see an art piece or an installation. If you don't give them visual feedback, they have a little bit of trouble, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit tricky to think about how can you give people visual feedback so they can, digest and really have fun with the installation, but really not ruin your main objective, which is sound.
Yeah, I see. And this was something that you didn't expect at the beginning?
I guess, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that you had an idea of how this was going to work and how would people react to this. Because what you're telling me, okay, people need like visual feedback, and did people react like differently than what you were expecting before?
No, I guess not. But the truth is, I hadn't really thought about how people would react about this. I mean, it's when you're doing thesis, everything is so fast paced, and you got to hand in so much stuff that you're trying to think about the user experience and how they're gonna experience it, but at the same time, it's really the first prototype when you get it done, and
Yeah.
and I got to install it in a gallery, which was nice, and from that I could do things a little bit differently now if I were to take it somewhere else. But I think I really didn't, I didn't really sit down and think about how people would interpret this or how people would react, because I knew I was setting this up sort of as a test. I had very little time to program everything and just finish everything and polish everything. So this was more of the experiment part of it, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I see that. Um, Now, like after something before. What would be the perfect setting for the installation? Would it be like a museum or a public space, or where?
I think a museum would be really interesting, and I think if this was done with a budget, it could get really interesting because then you could start using different audio technology, and you could start using really high-end directional speakers, for example, and then you could have really interesting effects with that. Instead of having, I did it in a room where there was a lot of echo and just the way I did it wasn't the optimal way to do it. It's just to do it in a room where the sound quality is really important, where the just a lot of things can change. I mean, I invested like $300 in this. It could be done with a lot more, and it could get more interesting. I'm not saying it's about the technology, but when you have the resources and just better technology, I think it could be more interesting. And a museum in a controlled scenario is really interesting, because I think you can really the experience. You can really direct the experience, and I think that's more interesting than putting it into a public space and let's see what happens.
Yeah, sure. Uh, did you have to deal with different people confronting the installation? I don't know. Maybe it was like your classmates, your teachers, but did you have like any like a different example? I don't know, a granny or a child or something, someone that don't necessarily have a direct approach to music.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of children interact with it the day of the exhibit, and it was really interesting because for them it was almost like a magic show. They ran around like crazy and they controlled the sound, and that was really something novel for them. And it's cool to see these kids having this experience because these kids are already fooling around with the iPad and with the latest technology that we have in consumer markets. But when you put something in front of them that hides the technology and really brings out something that they can do with their bodies and really augment the experience with their bodies, people usually go really crazy about these sort of things. And I guess that's the objective in general of the stuff we try to do. So when I see kids doing this type of stuff, it makes me really happy because it means I'm getting to the objective I wanted to get.
Sure. And how different you think it is, like the individual experience? Like, I mean, just one person playing with the installation, and as opposed like when you have like 7 people.
Yeah, I think it's really different. I think it works better when there's a single person. Not in terms of the technology, but I think it's a little bit of an illusion when people say, okay, I'm going to make an installation for people to collaborate. People don't collaborate. Like if people don't know each other, you can't expect them to hug and to shake hands and to if there's a group of friends there and they're all doing it together, then it's great. But if it's in a museum or a public space, you want to. I think it's a little bit pretentious to try to break the boundary of shyness or of uncomfortable situations. And the installation worked much better when it was a single individual, and when one single individual could really walk around and listen to how they were altering the space and the sound. I thought that it was a little bit more interesting. Other people thought the collective aspect of it was more interesting, but at the same time, this was in a gallery, this was an opening, so it was like all of my friends, a lot of people knew each other. So it was a scenario that wouldn't be the common scenario if you installed it in a museum.
Sure. Okay, and final question. Why do you think that making a sound installation is meaningful?
Meaningful to who, though?
I don't
to the
know.
world?
Yeah, in general.
I mean,
for you, maybe.
It was meaningful to me, and it is meaningful to me because it touches on something that is really important to me. It touches on something that has to do with my culture. It touches on something that has to do with something I'm very passionate about, which is Brazilian music and samba, and it's sort of a way to, it was a way to take, you know, the samba, which originated, you know, years and years ago, and try to reinterpret it. And I would be curious to know what, I would be very curious to know what the masters of samba would say if they walked into an installation like this, if they would hate it or they would like it, you know. The objective really was just to use these new tools and try to create a different way that people could experience this music, that has this wonderful music that has already been created and still is today created. I think that's why it's meaningful. It's meaningful because of what it brings, of culture, richness, music, etc. But and you know, I think people enjoyed it, and that's what's, I think that's what's most important.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering me and taking your time to making some time for me.
Of course.